All right, what's going on, everyone? So let's talk about the Battle of Bakhmut. Now, I spend a fair amount of time each day kind of looking up sources from both sides of this war, and I have zero confidence in who is actually winning this specific battle. Honestly, it sort of comes down to who you trust. So, thought it was worth walking through some of that to see if we can't come up with a couple ideas. At baseline, I feel comfortable saying that Bakhmut is a pretty nasty fight. There's plenty of videos, photos, and first person accounts coming from the battlefield to confirm that both sides are suffering pretty substantial casualties and that the conditions on the actual battlefield are pretty nasty. Not to overuse the comparison here, but to give you an idea, World War I style trench warfare is really what we're looking at in and around Bakhmut. Now, if you were listening to exclusively Ukrainian commentators, or more specifically, commentators that always paint anything in a positive light for Ukraine, you would probably hear that the Russians are running up against a wall of steel in Bakhmut and that the Ukrainian positions are holding despite everything that Russia is throwing at them. You'd also hear that Russia, or in this case, more specifically, the Wagner Group, and more on that in a second, are just pushing troops forward into some of these killing fields where their buddies were shot down hours or days prior. It's just a slaughter. On the other hand, if you were to only listen to Russian commentators, you'd hear that everything is going just fine in Bakhmut, all according to plan, that the Ukrainians are suffering far greater casualties than Russia, yet they continue to reinforce some of these positions, which is costing them any real chance at a further offensive anywhere else in the country. The most extreme views here are that the Ukrainian military is at risk of being entirely destroyed at Bakhmut. That, of course, doesn't exactly mean that like every Ukrainian soldier be killed, more so that enough would become casualties that the Ukrainian military as a whole is no longer an effective fighting force. I'm going to focus a little more here on the Russian viewpoint. Of course, Ukraine wants to hold all of their territory. So the question, to me at least, around Bakhmut is what is Russia doing there? So there's been a bit of a shift in why Bakhmut is important coming from Russian commentators. Right after Kherson traded hands from Russian occupied to Ukraine taking it back over a couple months ago, there was a lot of focus both in commentary as well as soldiers and equipment that shifted back to Bakhmut right away. Like as soon as it was confirmed that the Russians were actually pulling out of Kherson, I started seeing commentary like, yeah, Russia's pulling back there, but they're taking ground in Bakhmut, and that town's going to fall any day. Of course, that was like 2 months ago now. More recently, again, sticking with the Russian side here, there's been a lot more talk about how Bakhmut is important, not because it like opens the door to take other portions of Luhansk, but because that is the location where they will grind down the Ukrainian military, which kind of goes back to something that Putin said at the beginning of the war when he kicked off this entire conflict. He said one of his goals was the demilitarization of Ukraine. So it's not crazy that that demilitarization goal is what's being carried out in Bakhmut, and it would at least explain why there's been no real changes in territory as of late. So why Bakhmut? I mean, if you include Belarus, the front line in this conflict is something like 1,000 miles. So there's plenty of places that Russia could choose to try to attrit the Ukrainians. This could mean that at Bakhmut specifically, Russia feels like they have a substantial advantage in personnel, firepower, and or logistics, or at least enough of one to where over time they can inflict more casualties on the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians will inflict on them, which very well could be the case. It's just kind of odd that everything is focused on this one town. Another sort of mystery here, at least to me, is why the Wagner Group is so heavily involved at Bakhmut. I mean, if grinding down the Ukrainian military is a goal in this war, and that's what appears to be kind of front and center today, why is that being left to a private military company and not the actual Russian military? As much as the Wagner Group has been built up over the last few months, they don't have the manpower or resources the actual Russian army does, and it's not even close. Now we're getting into some speculation, but is it possible that the Wagner Group is fighting at Bakhmut because that's sort of a fixing operation where Russia would rather risk the Wagner soldiers than some of their own? I mean, if that's the case, then the actual Russian army could be freed up to carry out operations somewhere else. Who knows? Maybe that's in preparation for this big Russian offensive that some people think is coming. But even if all these Russian casualties coming out of Bakhmut are private military contractors and not actual Russian military, why risk so many lives and equipment to fix Ukraine in a position they were already holding? If you remember back to the start of the war, the idea of Russian feints and distractions were thrown out left and right every time the Russian military was either stopped or was advancing slower than expected. At the time, that wasn't crazy, just kind of the idea that the big Russian hammer was getting ready to drop at any minute. But looking back now, all of those supposed feints kind of look like Russian supporters explaining away lack of progress. And I wonder if that's kind of the deal with a fixing operation or the meat grinder set up at Bakhmut. Look, overall, Bakhmut's confusing. It seems like both sides have their own clear cut reason for being there, but especially in Russia's case, it's hard for me to make it make sense. But that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.